I've been working on a new program this week called the Happy Go Social School of Marketing, and it's been really interesting researching and looking at different things that would help support what I'm trying to teach in this class. Separately, I read an article in the Harvard Business Review about trust. And the more I sat with it, the more I realized that it explains not only why leadership sometimes breaks down inside organizations, but also why some voices earn trust online while others are slowly losing it. This idea comes from research by Harvard professor Frei and a leadership strategist, Anne Morris. And they describe trust as having a kind of architecture. It's not a vague emotional quality, it's actually structural. It sits on three specific pillars, like triangle, the trust triangle. The Greeks described these same pillars thousands of years ago using the rhetorical frameworks of ethos, logos, and pathos. Frei and Morris translate that into modern leadership language: authenticity, logic, and empathy. Authenticity answers the question, are you real? Logic answers the question, do you know what you're doing? And finally, empathy answers the question, do you care about me? When those three things are present together, trust tends to form naturally. But if one of those pillars weakens, the structure becomes unstable. Frei described that instability with a word that I think is surprisingly accurate. It is a wobble, which makes me think of a weeble. Most leadership failures are not dramatic collapses. They are trust wobbles. From the outside, it can look like a team suddenly stopped believing in its leader. Everything slows down, decisions are getting questioned. It's like their energy has completely been shot. But when you look closely, the breakdown doesn't usually happen all at once. One corner of trust had weakened while the others remained intact. What makes this insight useful is that most leaders focus their attention in the wrong place. They work to strengthen their strengths. They want to be smarter, more decisive, more persuasive. But trust rarely fails where you are the strongest. It fails where the structure is the weakest. Once you begin to look at leadership through that lens, the pattern becomes very difficult to unsee. The first place trust tends to wobble is authenticity. This is the moment when people start wondering whether they're interacting with a real person or a carefully constructed version of them. Do you see how this is like connecting dots between leadership and social media leadership? Many leaders unintentionally create this problem because professionalism often rewards control. Language becomes very polished. Conversations become rehearsed. Uncertainty disappears from the room. Just looks like they're a robot or like they're reading from ChatGPT. Nothing about that is inherently dishonest. In many cases, it is simply the result of something. None of that is inherently dishonest. In many cases, it's simply the result of someone trying to appear competent. But the side effect is distance between the leadership person and their employee, or the thought leader online and their follower. People begin to feel like they're interacting with a presentation rather than an actual human being. And human beings are remarkably good at detecting that shift. Even if they can't articulate exactly why something feels off, the instinct still is there. When authenticity weakens, trust begins to wobble. Uncanny Valley, I think, is a great example of that. Something just looks weird. Why does it have 6 fingers? The second place trust breaks is logic. And this is where people begin to question judgment and competence. What's interesting about this category is that many leaders who struggle with it are actually extremely capable and competent thinkers. Their problem isn't intelligence. Their problem is turning that intelligence into something translatable through communication with their people. A lot of thoughtful people explain ideas the way you might write an essay. They begin with context, then background, then they gradually build towards a conclusion. And in academic writing, that structure works really well. Readers have the patience to follow the argument. Once that question becomes visible, the work of your thought leadership online becomes so much more clear. What fascinated me the most about this research is how clearly it applies to the world most of us operate in every day online. Social media has quietly turned many people into leaders, whether they intended to be in that role or not. The moment you begin sharing ideas, interpreting problems, or teaching from your own experience, you become a kind of guide, and people decide whether or not they want to listen to you, whether they trust your thinking, and whether or not your perspective is worth carrying forward into whatever decision they're making in their life. And the evaluation process looks almost identical to the one happening inside organizations. People ask whether you feel authentic. Does the voice behind the idea sound like a real person with lived experience, or does it sound like a borrowed language from the latest marketing trend? They ask whether your logic holds together. Does your explanation make sense? Do your observations reveal competence and clarity around the topic? And they ask whether your intent includes them. Are you helping them understand something that improves their situation, or are they simply part of an audience that advances your platform? When one of those pillars weakens online, trust begins to wobble there. Some creators lose authenticity because their voice becomes overly polished or performative. Others lose logic because their content becomes inspirational but vague. It sounds encouraging, but the reasoning underneath it is never quite there. And some lose empathy because every post becomes a funnel. Every insight becomes some sort of a sales hook, and eventually the audience begins to feel less like people and more like prospects. Thought leadership, when it works, stabilizes those three pillars over time. Authenticity allows people to believe the voice behind the camera. Logic allows people to trust your thinking. Empathy allows people to feel that the work genuinely serves them. And when those three elements remain steady, something really interesting happens. People don't simply watch your content. They begin to carry your thinking with them as they're walking through the process of buying or selling a house. They reference your ideas in the conversations that they're having with other people, maybe even with other real estate agents. They apply your framework in their own decisions. In other words, your influence continues even when you are not in the room. Which brings us back to the original insight. The ultimate test of leadership isn't what happens when you're in the room, it's what happens when you're not. The people still trust the direction, still act with confidence, they still move forward using the ideas that you've shared, and the structure of trust is holding together. And that leaves us with a question that is probably more useful than asking how to gain more influence or build a larger audience. If trust is the architecture that holds leadership together both inside the organization and online, the more important question might simply be this: where is my own trust wobble? Because once you can see the weak corner of the triangle, you know exactly where the real work of thought leadership on and offline begins.